Ertuğrul was born into the world of the Oghuz Turkic tribes, where family, tribal loyalty, and leadership were extremely important. Historical sources about his early childhood are limited. So many details of his birth and youth remain uncertain. Later Ottoman traditions identify him as a member of the Kayı tribe and the son of Suleiman Shah, although accounts of his family background differ. Growing up in a nomadic or semi-nomadic community meant that Ertuğrul would have been surrounded by horses, livestock, tents, and traveling families. Children learned many practical skills from an early age and became familiar with the responsibilities of tribal life. The community depended on cooperation, courage, and knowledge of the land. These surroundings would have shaped the young Ertuğrul as he grew older. According to later traditions, Ertuğrul was one of the sons of Suleiman Shah. His family belonged to a tribal leadership tradition in which the welfare of the entire community was closely connected to the decisions of its leaders. Ertuğrul would have observed how elders settled disputes, organized migrations, protected their people, and made difficult decisions during times of uncertainty. Ertuğrul's family lived during a dangerous period of political change. The expansion of Mongol power and the weakening of established rulers created challenges for many Turkic communities. Migration could become necessary when pasture lands became unsafe or political conditions changed. For a young member of a tribal family, witnessing these events could provide important lessons about survival, leadership, and loyalty. As Ertuğrul grew into adulthood, the experiences of his family and tribe would become an important part of his identity. He was entering a world where tribal leaders had to protect their people while searching for new lands and alliances. Although the details of his childhood cannot be known with certainty, the traditions surrounding Ertuğrul present him as a young man shaped by family, community, migration, and the difficult political world of 13th century Anatolia. The Kayı were one of the Oghuz Turkic tribes associated with the long migrations of Turkic peoples across Central Asia and Anatolia. Their society was built around family connections, tribal leadership, cooperation, and the movement of communities in search of suitable lands. Life was closely connected to horses, livestock, seasonal pastures, and the natural environment. The tribe's strength depended not only on warriors but also on ordinary families, herders, craftsmen, and elders. Everyone had a role within the community. Horses were especially important for travel, communication, and warfare, while livestock provided food and other essential resources. The tribe had to remain organized whenever it moved from one region to another. Leadership was also essential to the survival of the tribe. Important decisions could affect the safety and future of the entire community. Leaders had to consider available pasture, political alliances, nearby enemies, and the needs of their families. For young men such as Ertuğrul, tribal life provided an environment in which leadership and responsibility could be learned through experience. The Kayı did not live in isolation. Their movements brought them into contact with other Turkic groups and with the established states of Anatolia. Trade, alliances, conflicts, and migration constantly changed relationships between communities. The tribe therefore needed both military strength and diplomacy to survive in an increasingly uncertain region. Over time, the Kayı's journey would become connected with one of the most important developments in medieval Anatolia. Ertuğrul would eventually lead his followers toward new lands in western Anatolia. His tribe was still relatively small compared with the great empires around it, but its determination and adaptability would help create the conditions for a remarkable future. The movement of Turkic tribes toward Anatolia was part of a much larger historical process that unfolded over generations. Political changes, warfare, pressure from expanding powers, and the search for pasture all influenced migration. Communities often traveled with their families and possessions, making migration a difficult journey that required careful planning. For a migrating tribe, the journey could take the community through mountains, valleys, rivers, and open plains. Finding water and pasture was essential, especially for horses and livestock. Families had to protect their belongings while traveling through unfamiliar territory. Every stage of the journey required cooperation between the members of the tribe. As the tribes moved westward, Anatolia offered opportunities as well as dangers. Some areas contained fertile land and important trade routes, while others were controlled by powerful rulers or threatened by conflict. The migrants had to understand the political landscape and decide where they could safely establish themselves. The journey also brought different communities into contact with one another. Tribes could trade, form alliances, negotiate access to land, or sometimes compete over resources. These encounters helped shape the political and cultural landscape of Anatolia. The Kayı were becoming part of a region where many different powers and communities were interacting. For Ertuğrul and his people, migration was more than simply traveling from one place to another. It was a search for security, opportunity, and a permanent future. Each new landscape brought new challenges and possibilities. Eventually, the Kayı would move deeper into Anatolia, where their story would become connected with the Seljuk rulers and the changing political world of the region. As the Kayı moved through Anatolia, the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum remained an important political power in the region. Seljuk rulers controlled major cities and trade routes, while their influence extended across large parts of Anatolia. For migrating Turkic tribes, establishing a relationship with powerful rulers could provide protection and opportunities to settle. According to later Ottoman traditions, Ertuğrul became connected with the Seljuk ruler and eventually received land in the region of Söğüt. However, many details of these events come from later sources and cannot be confirmed with certainty. What is clear is that the Kayı became established in northwestern Anatolia during a period when the Seljuk political order was weakening. The relationship between tribal leaders and the Seljuk state was important because Anatolia contained many competing powers. A tribe could gain security through alliances, while the rulers could benefit from the military support of experienced Turkic warriors. Such relationships were shaped by changing political circumstances and could shift as new threats emerged. During this period, Mongol influence over the Seljuk state was growing. The Seljuks faced increasing pressure, while smaller Turkic groups gained greater importance in frontier regions. These frontier communities often lived close to contested territories, where defending settlements and maintaining alliances were essential. Ertuğrul's tribe would eventually become part of this frontier world. Ertuğrul's association with the Seljuk frontier helped place his tribe in a strategically important part of Anatolia. The Kayı were no longer simply migrants searching for a home. They were becoming established among the frontier communities of the region. In the generations that followed, this frontier environment would provide the setting from which the Ottoman dynasty eventually emerged. By the 13th century, the Mongol Empire had become one of the most powerful forces in the known world. Its expansion had transformed the political landscape of Central Asia, Persia, and the lands around Anatolia. The Seljuk Sultanate of Rum increasingly found itself under Mongol pressure, while smaller Turkic communities had to make difficult decisions about their future. For the Turkic tribes living on the frontier, the arrival of Mongol power created uncertainty. Communities had to protect their families, livestock, and settlements while remaining aware of the movements of powerful armies. Ertuğrul and other tribal leaders operated in a world where political alliances could change quickly and survival depended on careful decisions. The Seljuk rulers were also struggling to maintain their authority. Mongol influence had grown significantly after the Seljuk defeat at the Battle of Köstag in 1243. After this defeat, the Seljuk state became increasingly dependent on Mongol power, creating a complicated political environment for tribes living in Anatolia. In this changing environment, frontier warriors became increasingly important. Turkic tribes living near the borders of different territories could defend settlements, escort travelers, and participate in conflicts when necessary. Their knowledge of the land and ability to move quickly gave them an advantage in the difficult frontier regions of Anatolia. Later Ottoman traditions portray Ertuğrul as a courageous leader who supported the Seljuks and fought against enemies threatening the region. However, the surviving historical evidence does not provide enough detail to confidently identify every battle traditionally associated with him. His story was preserved and expanded through Ottoman-era traditions that remembered him as an important frontier leader. For Ertuğrul's community, conflict affected much more than warriors. Families needed food, water, and safe places to live, while shepherds had to protect their animals and farmers had to care for their crops. During dangerous times, the entire tribe depended on its leaders for protection and organization. Ertuğrul therefore had to think not only about fighting, but also about the survival and safety of his people. The Seljuk political system was becoming weaker as Mongol influence increased. This gave smaller Turkic frontier groups more opportunities to establish settlements and increase their influence. Local leaders had to protect their people, build alliances, and secure useful lands and routes. Across Anatolia, these changing conditions were creating opportunities for new Turkic principalities to emerge. Ertuğrul's community lived in a region where political relationships could change quickly. The Kayı had to deal with Seljuk authorities, neighboring Turkic tribes, and other local powers. Ertuğrul needed both courage and diplomacy to protect his people. Sometimes cooperation could provide safety, while at other times the tribe needed to defend itself and remain prepared for danger. Mongol expansion changed the political world in which Ertuğrul lived. Older powers were becoming weaker, while new frontier communities were gaining importance. For the Kayı, these changes eventually encouraged their movement toward Western Anatolia. There they would find new challenges, new opportunities, and a frontier environment where small communities could build their own future. The period of Mongol expansion was difficult, but it also created opportunities for new political powers. Ertuğrul and the Kayı continued their journey toward the western frontier, searching for a secure homeland. Their story would eventually become connected with Söğüt and, in the next generation, with his son Osman. From this small frontier community would eventually emerge the Ottoman dynasty. As the political situation in Anatolia continued to change, Ertuğrul and the Kayı tribe moved toward the western frontier. This region was very different from the lands they had previously crossed. It contained forests, valleys, farming settlements, frontier forts, and important roads connecting different communities. The western frontier was a place where different cultures and political powers met. Turkic tribes lived alongside Byzantine communities and other local groups. This created both opportunities and dangers for newcomers who wanted to establish themselves in the region. For Ertuğrul, gaining influence was not simply about winning battles. His community needed land where families could settle and livestock could find pasture. A secure homeland would give the tribe the opportunity to grow stronger and more organized. The Kayı's movement into the frontier region gradually changed their position. They were no longer simply travelers searching for somewhere to live. They were becoming a community with a permanent interest in the land and the political relationships around it. Leadership became increasingly important as the tribe grew. Ertuğrul had to listen to elders, understand the needs of families, and make decisions about the tribe's future. His authority depended on his ability to maintain unity during uncertain times. The frontier also demanded awareness of nearby settlements and roads. Knowing where travelers moved and where rival groups were located could help a community avoid unnecessary danger. The landscape itself became an important part of frontier strategy. Ertuğrul's growing reputation would have depended on more than military courage. A successful tribal leader needed to build trust among his followers. Families had to believe that their leader could guide them through difficult circumstances and protect the community's interests. The political weakness of the Seljuk state created a new frontier environment. Smaller Turkic communities increasingly had opportunities to establish themselves independently. The Kayı were part of this wider movement of frontier groups developing their own influence. Ertuğrul also needed relationships with neighboring communities. Cooperation could provide access to trade routes, pasture, and safer travel. Diplomacy was therefore an important part of building a strong position in the frontier. Trade was another important part of frontier life. Roads connecting towns and settlements carried merchants, animals, food, and valuable goods. Communities that could maintain safe routes could become increasingly important in the local economy. The Kayı also needed productive land for their growing community. Pastures provided food for livestock, while nearby agricultural areas could support settled families. Finding the right balance between nomadic traditions and permanent settlement would become increasingly important. According to later Ottoman traditions, Ertuğrul eventually became associated with the area around Söğüt. The exact details of how he received or established control over the territory are not fully documented by contemporary sources, but Söğüt became closely connected with the early Ottoman story. Söğüt's location was important because it stood near a frontier between different political and cultural worlds. From such a position, A small community could interact with neighboring settlements while gradually increasing its influence. The Kayı settlement did not become powerful overnight. Building influence required years of cooperation, settlement, leadership, and adaptation. The tribe had to establish itself while responding to the changing political conditions around it. Ertuğrul's leadership was therefore connected to the gradual development of his community. Instead of focusing only on individual victories, his story can be understood through the growth of a tribe that was finding a permanent place within frontier society. The frontier was also a place where courage could earn respect. Communities needed leaders who were willing to protect their people when danger appeared. Ertuğrul's later reputation was strongly associated with this image of a courageous frontier leader. At the same time, Ertuğrul could not afford constant conflict. Every unnecessary confrontation could place families and resources at risk. Successful frontier leadership required knowing when force was necessary and when peaceful cooperation was more useful. The changing balance between the Seljuks, Mongols, Byzantine frontier communities, and Turkic tribes created a complex political environment. No single power controlled every part of the frontier. This allowed smaller leaders to find opportunities for expansion and influence. For the Kayı, stability was especially valuable. Once families felt safer, they could raise livestock, cultivate land, build homes, and establish stronger community institutions. A stable settlement could gradually become more important than a temporary tribal camp. As the community became more established, the younger generation grew up in a different environment. Instead of constantly moving, they could develop stronger connections with the land around their settlement. This helped create the foundation for a more permanent frontier society. Ertuğrul's family was also becoming important to the future of the tribe. His sons, including Osman according to Ottoman tradition, would grow up surrounded by the challenges and opportunities of frontier life. The experiences of one generation would influence the next. The frontier environment encouraged communities to become adaptable. They could preserve their Turkic traditions while interacting with neighboring peoples and adopting useful local practices. This mixture of traditions would become an important feature of the developing society. Ertuğrul's growing influence should therefore be understood as a gradual process rather than a single dramatic event. His community developed through settlement, alliances, leadership, and adaptation to the political conditions of the frontier. The importance of this period becomes clearer when looking at what came afterward. The Kayı were establishing themselves in an area where new political powers could emerge. Their settlement provided a base from which later generations could build greater influence. Ertuğrul's generation did not create the Ottoman Empire itself. That transformation came later, especially under his son Osman, according to Ottoman historical tradition. But the settlement and frontier environment associated with Ertuğrul became an important part of the story that preceded the Ottoman state. The story of Ertuğrul, therefore, represents a period of transition. The old political order of Anatolia was weakening, while smaller frontier communities were becoming more significant. The Kayı were positioned within this transformation at an important moment in regional history. For the people around him, Ertuğrul's greatest achievement was not simply being remembered as a warrior. His importance was connected to guiding his community through migration and uncertainty and helping establish it in a new homeland. These foundations would matter greatly to the generations that followed. As the Kayı became more firmly established, the frontier around them continued to change. New alliances appeared, neighboring powers competed for influence, and the balance of power remained uncertain. The community would need to remain prepared for whatever challenges came next. The beginning of Ertuğrul's power was therefore a story of gradual growth. A migrating tribe had found a place where it could settle, develop relationships, and build a stronger community. From this modest beginning, the next generation would inherit an increasingly important frontier position. Ertuğrul's era was approaching its later chapter, but the foundations had been laid. The Kayı had found a homeland, a community had taken root, and a new generation was growing up on the frontier. Soon, the story would move toward Osman, whose rise would take this small frontier community into a new and much larger chapter of history. After years of movement and uncertainty, the Kayı community became associated with the region of Söğüt in northwestern Anatolia. Söğüt was not a great imperial capital, It was a frontier settlement in a region where different political and cultural worlds met. For the Kayı, the new homeland meant more than simply having a place to camp. Families could begin developing more permanent homes, caring for livestock, cultivating land, and building stronger connections with the surrounding region. The surrounding countryside was important for the community's survival. Pasture provided food for animals, forests supplied useful materials, and nearby farmland could support agriculture. Söğüt also placed the Kayı in a frontier environment where they could encounter travelers and merchants. Roads connected different settlements, allowing goods and information to move through the region. For a growing community, access to these routes could become economically and strategically valuable. Life on the frontier was never completely peaceful. The Kayı lived in a region where political boundaries were not always clear and where neighboring powers could compete for influence. Ertuğrul's leadership became especially important during this period of settlement. He had to consider the needs of families, livestock, farmers, warriors, and elders. A successful leader had to maintain unity while guiding the community through the challenges of frontier life. The settlement also gave younger members of the tribe a different kind of life. Children could grow up surrounded by a more permanent community instead of constantly traveling. They learned traditional skills from their families while becoming familiar with the land that would eventually become their homeland. The location also encouraged interaction with neighboring communities. Trade, diplomacy, and everyday contact allowed people from different backgrounds to meet. Such interactions could involve exchanging goods, discussing local issues, or simply sharing the roads and resources of the frontier. The Kayı did not become a powerful state immediately after settling in Söğüt. Their early community remained relatively small compared with the larger political powers surrounding them. Its importance developed gradually as the settlement became more organized and its leaders gained greater influence. The weakening of Seljuk authority created an increasingly fragmented political environment. Local rulers and frontier leaders had greater opportunities to establish their own territories. Söğüt's frontier position also brought the Kayı closer to Byzantine territories. Across the region were towns, fortifications, villages, and roads connected with the Byzantine world. The relationship between frontier Turkic communities and Byzantine neighbors could involve both competition and peaceful interaction. For Ertuğrul, establishing a homeland meant creating a foundation for the future. A community with permanent land could grow in population and resources. The tribe's economy depended on several activities. Livestock remained important, while agriculture and local trade could provide additional resources. Craftsmen produced tools, clothing, equipment, and household items needed by the community. Religion and tradition were also important parts of community life. Families passed customs and beliefs from one generation to another. Mosques, religious teachers, elders, and community gatherings helped strengthen social connections as the settlement became more established. The surrounding forests and mountains also shaped everyday life. They provided natural resources but could make travel difficult. As years passed, the Kayı became increasingly connected to the frontier around them. Their settlement was no longer simply a stopping point in a long migration. It was becoming a place where families could build homes, raise children, develop farms, and imagine a future for their descendants. Ertuğrul's generation therefore played an important transitional role in the traditional Ottoman story. They belonged to a world of migration and tribal life, but they were also establishing the foundations of a more permanent frontier community. Among the younger generation was Osman, Ertuğrul's son according to Ottoman tradition. Growing up in this frontier environment meant that Osman would witness the challenges of leadership, settlement, diplomacy, and conflict from an early age. The world around him would help shape the future leader he would become. The importance of Söğüt would become clearer only after Ertuğrul's lifetime. At the time, it was simply a frontier homeland for a relatively small community. But its location and the political changes surrounding it would later make it an important part of the story of the early Ottoman dynasty. The Kayı settlement also demonstrated how migration could eventually lead to permanent roots. For Ertuğrul, the new homeland represented an opportunity to leave something lasting for his descendants. Now his community had a base from which the next generation could pursue its own ambitions. Söğüt would later become closely associated with the early Ottoman story, but its significance developed over time. The settlement provided the geographical and social foundation from which Osman and later generations could expand their influence. The journey of the Kayı had brought them from a life of migration toward a new homeland in western Anatolia. In Söğüt, they found land, community, and a place where the next generation could grow. Ertuğrul's story was approaching its final chapter, but the foundations he helped establish would soon be inherited by Osman. From this frontier homeland, a new chapter in Anatolian history was about to begin. Ertuğrul is remembered in Ottoman tradition as a leader who guided the Kayı tribe during a period of major political change. His leadership developed in a world where migration, frontier politics, and uncertainty were part of everyday life. Leadership in a tribal community was very different from ruling a large centralized empire. A leader had to remain connected to ordinary families and understand their daily problems. Food, pasture, livestock, migration routes, and security were all important concerns. The Kayı had experienced migration before settling in western Anatolia. Years of movement had taught the community how difficult it could be to find safe land and maintain its way of life. Once the tribe became established around Söğüt, leadership became focused not only on movement, but also on creating stability. A strong leader also needed the support of experienced elders. Important decisions could involve discussions about where to settle, how to respond to political developments, and how to deal with neighboring communities. Tribal leadership was therefore not simply one person giving orders. It involved consultation and collective responsibility. The frontier environment made these decisions particularly important. The Kayı lived near territories influenced by different political powers. Travelers, merchants, neighboring tribes, and local communities moved through the same region. Ertuğrul had to understand this changing environment and decide how his community could survive within it. One of the most important qualities expected from a frontier leader was the ability to protect his community. Protection did not always mean fighting. It could involve choosing safe routes, watching important passes, maintaining alliances, and making sure that families were not exposed to unnecessary danger. The traditional stories about Ertuğrul often emphasize courage, but courage alone could not sustain a community. A leader also needed patience and judgment. A decision made too quickly could bring danger to hundreds of people, while a carefully considered decision could preserve peace and stability. Diplomacy was another important part of frontier leadership. Neighboring groups could become allies, trading partners, or competitors depending on circumstances. Maintaining communication with surrounding communities could help reduce unnecessary conflict and create opportunities for cooperation. Trade also played a role in the life of frontier communities. Merchants needed safe roads, while settlements benefited from the exchange of food, animals, tools, clothing, and other goods. A stable environment could help a small settlement become economically stronger over time. Ertuğrul's community depended heavily on livestock. Horses were important for travel and communication, while sheep and other animals provided essential resources. Protecting grazing land and water sources was therefore an important part of maintaining the tribe's strength. Agriculture became increasingly important as the community established more permanent roots. Fields could provide food for families and reduce dependence on constant movement. The combination of farming, livestock, and trade helped create a more stable economic foundation for the settlement. A leader also needed to consider the welfare of people who were not warriors. Families, children, farmers, shepherds, craftsmen, and elders all depended on the security of the settlement. The strength of the tribe came from the cooperation of all these different members. The political decline of the Seljuk Sultanate created a difficult environment. Central authority was weakening, while Mongol influence remained significant. For frontier communities, this meant that local leaders increasingly had to make decisions without relying completely on a powerful central government. This changing political world created opportunities as well as dangers. Small frontier communities could establish themselves in areas where central authority was weak, but they also had to compete with other groups and remain alert to changing alliances. Ertuğrul's traditional reputation grew within this frontier environment. Later Ottoman writers remembered him as a respected leader whose community survived during a difficult period. Although many details were recorded much later, These traditions became an important part of the story of the Ottoman dynasty. The importance of leadership could also be seen during migration. Even after reaching Söğüt, the community still had to move animals, supplies, and people when necessary. Ertuğrul's role involved helping the tribe adapt to the changing conditions of the frontier. Communication was essential in such a community. Messages had to travel between settlements and tribal groups, sometimes across difficult terrain. Mounted riders could carry information quickly, allowing leaders to respond to developments in distant areas. The natural environment also influenced decisions. Mountains could provide protection, rivers supplied water, and forests offered resources. A leader who understood the landscape could choose better locations for settlements, camps, and travel routes. Frontier leadership also required awareness of nearby fortifications. Byzantine settlements and fortified towns existed across western Anatolia. Their presence meant that the Kayı lived close to communities with different political interests and military traditions. Relations with neighboring communities could change over time. A group that was friendly during one period could become a competitor later. This meant that Ertuğrul and other leaders needed to remain flexible and avoid creating unnecessary enemies. The Kayı's growing settlement around Söğüt provided an important base. Families could develop permanent homes, cultivate land, and raise their children in a more stable environment. This stability gave the community time to develop stronger social and economic connections. Ertuğrul's leadership can therefore be understood as a gradual process. It was not simply one battle or one political event that created his reputation. Instead, his story developed through years of migration, settlement, community organization, diplomacy, and life on the frontier. The role of tradition is important when discussing Ertuğrul. Much of what is popularly known about him comes from later Ottoman sources rather than detailed contemporary records. Therefore, historians must separate firmly documented events from stories that developed through later tradition. Despite these uncertainties, Ertuğrul became an important figure in Ottoman historical memory. Later generations looked back at him as one of the early ancestors of the dynasty. His story represented the difficult frontier world from which the Ottoman state eventually emerged. Family was another important part of Ertuğrul's legacy. According to Ottoman tradition, his son Osman grew up during these years of frontier life. Osman would inherit not an empire, but a small community with experience, traditions, and a strategic position. The lessons of frontier life could be passed from one generation to another. Young members of the tribe learned about horses, travel, farming, community responsibilities, and the political world around them. These experiences prepared them for the challenges of adulthood. For Ertuğrul, protecting the community meant thinking about the future as well as the present. A decision that helped the tribe survive today could also affect the opportunities available to the next generation. Establishing a stable homeland was therefore one of the most important long-term goals. As the Kayı became more established, their frontier position gave them access to new opportunities. They could participate in local trade, establish relationships with neighboring communities, and gradually increase their influence. Their growth remained modest, but its direction was becoming significant. Ertuğrul's leadership was also remembered through values such as loyalty, courage, family responsibility, and determination. These qualities became central to the way later generations described him. Whether every traditional story can be historically confirmed or not, his image remained powerful in Ottoman historical memory. The frontier was never completely secure, and Ertuğrul's community remained surrounded by changing political forces. But the Kayı had something they had lacked during their earlier migrations, a place they could call home. This gave the tribe a stronger foundation for the future. A leader's influence could also be measured by the unity of his community. If families remained together during difficult times, the tribe could survive challenges that might destroy a divided group. Maintaining this unity required trust between leaders, elders, warriors, and ordinary families. Ertuğrul's world was also one of constant movement of information. News about political changes, neighboring rulers, trade routes, and military activity could affect decisions. Leaders therefore needed reliable messengers and people who understood what was happening beyond their own settlement. The ability to remain calm during uncertainty was another valuable leadership quality. Frontier communities could face sudden changes in political conditions, but panic could make difficult situations worse. Careful planning and cooperation helped the Kayı respond to challenges without abandoning their long-term goals. Over time, the Kayı became part of the larger frontier society of Western Anatolia. Their identity remained connected to their Turkic tribal traditions, but they also interacted with the people and cultures around them. This environment helped shape the society that later generations would inherit. The importance of Söğüt was therefore connected to both geography and history. It gave the Kayı access to fertile land, pasture, roads, and a frontier position. From this location, the community could observe and participate in the changing political world around it. Ertuğrul's generation helped establish the conditions in which Osman could later act. Osman would inherit a community that had already experienced migration, settlement, diplomacy, and frontier politics. The foundations were modest, but they provided a starting point for future expansion. The story of Ertuğrul's leadership is therefore closely connected with patience and gradual development. His community did not become powerful in a single moment. It developed step by step through settlement, cooperation, adaptation, and the changing political circumstances of Anatolia. By establishing themselves in the frontier region, the Kayı became part of a world where new political powers were emerging. Several small Turkic principalities would eventually develop in Anatolia. Among these frontier communities, the one associated with Osman would later become extraordinarily influential. Ertuğrul's role was that of a leader standing between two eras. Behind him was the world of migration and tribal movement. Ahead was a more settled frontier society where his descendants could develop their own political ambitions. For ordinary Kayı families, the most important sign of success was simple. They had a place where they could live. Children could grow up, animals could graze, crops could be planted, and homes could be built. These everyday achievements formed the foundation of a lasting community. As Ertuğrul grew older, the community he had guided was becoming increasingly established. His greatest legacy would not simply be a reputation for courage, but the community that survived and continued after his lifetime. The future of that community would soon depend on the next generation. Osman was growing up in a world where the frontier offered both danger and opportunity. He could see how leadership worked, how alliances were formed, and how a small community could survive among larger powers. These experiences would later become important in his own story. The political landscape around the Kayı continued to evolve. Seljuk authority weakened further, Mongol influence remained important, and Byzantine frontier territories continued to exist nearby. This created a situation in which local leaders could gradually gain more independence. The community's ability to adapt was perhaps its greatest strength. The Kayı had survived migration, political uncertainty, and the challenges of frontier life. Their experience had taught them how to respond when circumstances changed. Ertuğrul's leadership should therefore be viewed within the broader history of Anatolia. He was part of a generation living through the decline of older political structures and the rise of new frontier communities. His story became important because of what happened in the generations that followed. Later Ottoman historians gave Ertuğrul an important place in the dynasty's early story. Their accounts helped preserve his name and connect him with the origins of the Ottoman ruling family. Modern historians, however, recognize that some details of these later accounts cannot be independently confirmed. What can be seen more clearly is the importance of the frontier environment in which Osman and his community developed. Western Anatolia offered opportunities for small Turkic groups to establish themselves and expand their influence. The Kayı's position around Söğüt placed them within this important historical setting. Ertuğrul's story was therefore reaching the end of one chapter. He had guided a community through migration and helped establish it in a new homeland. The tribe was now prepared to enter a new period under the leadership of the next generation. The story that followed would be much larger than the life of one tribal leader. Osman would inherit the community and eventually establish a new political movement that would become the foundation of the Ottoman state. But before that transformation could happen, the groundwork had already been laid. Ertuğrul is remembered as the leader who stood at the beginning of this transition. His era was shaped by migration, frontier life, political uncertainty, and the search for a secure homeland. The community he helped guide would pass its traditions and experience to Osman. And from that small frontier society, one of history's most famous dynasties would eventually emerge. Ertuğrul Ghazi's story was not only about battles, migration, and leadership. At the center of his life was also his family, whose future would become deeply connected with the history of Anatolia. His household became part of a small frontier community that was gradually establishing itself in a difficult and changing region. According to Ottoman tradition, Ertuğrul was married to Halim Hatun. She is remembered in later accounts as an important figure in his family life, although many details about her historical biography remain uncertain. Together, Ertuğrul and Halim became associated with a family that would eventually produce one of the most important ruling dynasties in history. Their children grew up in a world very different from the one known today. There were no modern cities, schools, roads, or communications. Life depended heavily on family, tribe, horses, agriculture, trade, and the ability to survive political instability. Among Ertuğrul's sons, Osman became the most historically significant. He was born into a frontier society where leadership was not simply inherited through a formal system. A young man had to learn courage, diplomacy, responsibility, and the difficult realities of life on a constantly changing frontier. Osman would have witnessed his father dealing with tribal matters from an early age. He could observe how Ertuğrul listened to people, settled disputes, negotiated with neighboring powers, and made decisions when the safety of the community was at stake. The relationship between father and son was therefore more than a simple family connection. It represented the passing of experience from one generation to another. Ertuğrul belonged to the generation that established the community, while Osman would later become associated with its transformation into a growing political power. The frontier itself was an important teacher. Byzantine settlements existed nearby, while various Turkic groups competed for land and influence. The Seljuk Sultanate of Rum was weakening, creating opportunities but also dangers for small frontier communities. Osman grew up during this period of political uncertainty. He would have learned that survival depended not only on fighting, but also on understanding the interests of neighboring communities. A successful frontier leader needed both courage and patience. Ertuğrul's family was also connected to the everyday responsibilities of the settlement. Food had to be prepared, animals cared for, clothing made, and supplies protected. Behind every military campaign was a community working to maintain ordinary life. The family's life was shaped by movement as well. Turkic frontier communities often had traditions of seasonal migration and pastoral activity. Horses, sheep, tents, and supplies were essential parts of their world. Under Orhan, the Ottomans expanded further into northwestern Anatolia and across the Bosporus into southeastern Europe. This marked an important transformation from a frontier principality into a regional power. Generations later, Ottoman rulers would capture Constantinople in 1453 under Mehmed II. By then, the political community associated with Osman had become a major empire. The transformation from Ertuğrul's frontier community to the Ottoman Empire took more than 2 centuries. It was the result of many rulers, soldiers, administrators, scholars, merchants, farmers, and ordinary families. This is why Ertuğrul's legacy should not be described as if he personally created the empire. His contribution was earlier and more foundational. He belonged to the generation that helped establish a community in a frontier region. His son belonged to the generation that transformed that community into a growing principality. Later Ottoman rulers expanded that principality even further. Each generation inherited institutions, territories, experiences, and traditions from those who came before. Ertuğrul's name, therefore, became part of the dynasty's origin story. Ottoman chroniclers and later traditions remembered him as an important ancestor of the ruling house. Over the centuries, stories about Ertuğrul became more elaborate. Some accounts describe dramatic adventures and heroic encounters that are difficult to verify independently. This does not mean that Ertuğrul was unimportant. It means that historians must distinguish between what can be documented and what belongs to later tradition. The documented history of the early Ottoman dynasty becomes clearer with Osman and his successors. Their political actions created institutions that could support continued expansion. The Ottoman rise was therefore not simply a story of battles. It was also a story of organization. Territories needed administration, communities needed protection, trade needed routes, and rulers needed systems of government. Religion also became an important part of Ottoman identity. Islamic institutions, scholars, charitable traditions, and religious communities developed alongside the expanding state. The empire that eventually emerged was therefore the product of a long historical process. Ertuğrul stood near the beginning of that process, while Osman and later rulers carried it forward. For millions of people who would later live under Ottoman rule, the empire became a major political and cultural force. Yet its earliest roots remained connected to a small frontier society in western Anatolia. Ertuğrul's story therefore represents a broader lesson in history. Great changes often begin with small communities whose members cannot know what their descendants will eventually achieve. The people around Ertuğrul were concerned with ordinary matters: food, shelter, animals, family, security, and survival. Yet their decisions became part of a much larger historical story. When we look back at Ertuğrul today, it is easy to see the future and imagine that the rise of the Ottoman Empire was inevitable. It was not. Many political outcomes were possible. What makes his story fascinating is precisely this uncertainty. A small frontier community survived difficult circumstances, and its descendants eventually created one of the most powerful states of the medieval and early modern world. Ertuğrul did not live to see the Ottoman Empire. He did not witness Constantinople becoming an Ottoman capital, nor did he see the vast territories later controlled by Ottoman rulers. But history remembers him because the story did not end with his lifetime. From the frontier community associated with Ertuğrul came Osman. From Osman came a dynasty. And from that dynasty grew an empire that would shape the history of 3 continents for centuries. Ertuğrul's legacy was therefore not the empire itself, but the foundation from which that remarkable story began. Ertuğrul Ghazi did not establish the Ottoman Empire himself, but he became an important figure in the story of its origins. He was associated with a Turkic frontier community in western Anatolia during a period of political uncertainty. After Ertuğrul's generation, his son Osman became the central figure in the development of a new frontier principality. Osman inherited a community positioned near Byzantine territories, where political instability created opportunities for expansion. His leadership gradually transformed the small community into a more powerful regional force. The rise of the Ottomans was not an overnight event. It developed through a combination of military campaigns, alliances, diplomacy, settlement, trade, and political organization. The weakening of the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum created an increasingly fragmented political environment. Several small Turkic principalities appeared across Anatolia, each competing for territory and influence. Among them, Osman's principality gradually became one of the most successful. Osman's successors continued the expansion. His son Orhan played a major role in developing the early Ottoman state, expanding into important towns and strengthening its political and military organization. The Ottomans were slowly changing from a small frontier principality into a significant regional power. The Ottoman expansion eventually crossed into southeastern Europe. Over the following generations, Ottoman rulers gained control over increasingly large territories. What had begun as a small frontier community in western Anatolia was becoming a state with ambitions far beyond its original homeland. One of the greatest turning points came in 1453 when Sultan Mehmed II captured Constantinople. By then, more than a century and a half had passed since Osman's early rise. The conquest transformed the Ottoman state into one of the major powers of the region. Ertuğrul's legacy should therefore be understood as a foundation rather than the creation of the empire itself. He belonged to an earlier generation that helped establish the community from which Osman emerged. Later rulers expanded that foundation through their own achievements. Over the centuries, Ertuğrul became an important figure in Ottoman historical tradition. Stories about his courage, leadership, family, and frontier life were preserved and expanded by later generations. Some details are difficult to verify, but his place in the traditional origin story of the Ottoman dynasty remained powerful. The story of Ertuğrul and the Ottoman rise is ultimately a story of generations. Ertuğrul's generation established a frontier community, Osman transformed it into a growing principality, and later rulers expanded it into an empire. Ertuğrul never saw the Ottoman Empire, but the foundation associated with his life became part of a political story that would shape the history of Europe, Asia, and the Middle East for centuries.